All right, so it's time for Rocky to start his day. As you can see, he's chomping at the bit. There you go, my friend. Quite the cat, I'll tell you. Yeah. There you go. All right. Well, um, it's funny talking about different things. Different things I remember from when I was a kid. Um, there's this story. This is actually kind of funny what happened. Um, my dad's sister, my Aunt Teresa, she's actually still alive. She's quite elderly now, and she's blind and has a bunch of problems. But she was a really bad alcoholic. Like, I mean, she was a really serious alcoholic to the point where it was it was a bit things got really interesting sometimes with her. I'll tell you some of the crazy things she'd do. Anyway, the thing is, hey you, hi Rocky. The thing is, I'll tell you this story though, of things that happen, and it brings it. I'm just thinking about this because I told the story before earlier in the week about the couple that died in the car at the end of the laneway there at that farm outside of Perth. But hey you, hi beautiful boy. Anyway, because they fell asleep and the carbon monoxide got them. They kept the car running so the heater would run. Basically, they went into the back seat to saw off a piece of tail. They parked at the end of the laneway there, and they did that. And the old car was rusty and had a faulty exhaust system. And they ended up falling asleep in the back seat together. And they were asphyxiated. The carbon monoxide got them, and the old farmer that lived there, he come to the end of the laneway and found them in the morning, the two of them, in the back of the car, and they were both dead, Anyway, but it reminds me of a story. My Aunt Teresa, when I was a kid, well, when I was a real small kid, she was married. She was with her husband, and then they split up, and she ended up with a guy by the name of Charlie Virgin. That was the guy's name, believe it or not, Charlie Virgin. And anyway, her and Charlie were together for a few years. And then, again, when I was around 6 years old, 6 or 7, her and Charlie split up. And Charlie went out west, like a lot of men from around here did at the time, because there was work out west. There was work in the oil patch and all that. So anyway, he went out west. And he bought a beat-up old car, and he went out west with it, which was a common thing back then. In those days, you could buy a beat-up old car for $50, and you could drive the thing, Some of those old $50 cars would last for 2 or 3 years. Our neighbor, actually, Wilf Sproul, had a $50 car that he drove into town to work every day. It was an early 50s Chev. It was like a 51 or a 52 Chev. And he drove that car into work. He was the night watchman at the Heritage Silversmiths plant, where they made silverware there and stuff, And anyway, he drove that car to work every night, and he drove it home every morning. I don't think it ever went anywhere other than from our neighborhood to the silversmiths plant and back again. But that was a $50 car anyway, and he drove that thing for like 3 years. He did. And then his wife had the good car, which I believe was either a 65 or a 66 Chev Impala. That was the good car they had. But anyway, I remember that car. It was black with a royal blue interior. It was a beautiful car. That's a car that would be worth a lot of money now. It was a two-door too. So that the 66 Impala was. It's either 65 or 66, I'm not sure. But that car, if that car were around today, it would be worth a fortune. But anyway, getting back to the story about my Aunt Teresa and Charlie Virgin. Charlie Virgin bought an old beat up heap of a car for $50 and he went out west in it. And that was the last we saw of Charlie Virgin for a long time. Well, word came back to us that Charlie had died in the car. That Charlie had stopped somewhere to sleep and he had left the engine running and he had been asphyxiated. That the carbon monoxide had got him. And again, in those days, that wasn't an unusual thing, because there were a lot of people driving these old beat-up cars. It was a very common thing. That's the thing about those days. But one of the things I remember about those days is, most people didn't have a lot of money, but you really didn't need a lot of money. You could function on very little money back then because the living was so cheap. But it was also risky, because if you didn't have money to buy better things, it meant that you were using stuff that was way past its expiry date, you could say. And so you were dealing with stuff a lot of the time that wasn't really safe. And so, being poor, you could function as a poor person back then far better than you can function now as a poor person. But there was still a lot of risk involved in being poor. Poverty killed back then, just like it does now. It just killed for different reasons, killed in different ways. And one of the ways it killed is people were driving these cars that really probably shouldn't have been on the road anymore. They were in such bad shape. And, people died in those cars sometimes. So that was the other side of it, either from carbon monoxide or from accidents that happen when suspension components failed or when brakes failed or whatever. But anyway, getting back to the story though, so we got word that Charlie had been killed in this car, that he had fallen asleep in the car and he died from carbon monoxide poisoning, which again wasn't surprising. We used to hear of it all the time. Flash forward to 1994. Now this was around 1974-75 that Charlie went away, and then we thought he was killed because that's what we were told. So we're going, 74 to 84, about 20 years, Well, I get a knock on my door. I was living above the Royal Bank in Perth. I get a knock at my door, and who is it but my Aunt Teresa, and she's standing there with this guy. Now, I didn't recognize him because I hadn't seen Charlie since he was a young man, and he wasn't a young man anymore. But she's standing there, and she says to me, "Do you know who this is?" And I looked the guy up and down, and I said, "No, no, I don't." And she says, "It's Charlie." And I said, "Charlie who?" She said, "Charlie Virgin." And I said, "Charlie Virgin?" I said, "That's impossible. Charlie Virgin has been dead for 20 years. It turns out it was him, though, anyway. It was Charlie Virgin. And it turns out they got their wires crossed is what happened. Holy shit, there's no back in this. This shirt has no back in it. I knew I had a tear here. I didn't know that there was no back in my shirt. The shirt has no back in it. I just put my hand back here. Anyway, that was a little diversion, I guess. It turns out there was another man who had done the same thing Charlie had from Perth, a guy by the name of Eddie Dellier. And Eddie Dellier had done the same thing Charlie did. He bought a beat-up old car for $50, and he drove it out west, looking for work in the oil patch or whatever, looking to make his fortune, I guess, And because you could make good money out there. It was one of those places, and like I say, and in that world back then, you didn't need a lot of money to live, so you could be rich fairly easily if you could get a job with a really good wage, which was the point of going out west, because you get into the oil patch, you'd be well paid. you know, really hard, difficult, dangerous work, but you'd be well paid for it too. Anyway, Rocky wants water. It turns out it was Eddie Dellier that had been asphyxiated in his car. He had gone to sleep in the back of the car. Oh, there you go. Okay, there you go, sweetheart. Quite a cat he is. Yeah, that's yours. That's yours, sweetie. That's your water. Anyway, yeah. So Eddie, it was Eddie Dellier. That was the guy's name that had died in the car anyway out west. It wasn't Charlie Virgin at all. But for 20 years, we believed that Charlie Virgin had died from it being asphyxiated with carbon monoxide in a car out west, you know. And so, like I say, it was kind of like seeing a ghost when she showed up at the door with Charlie Virgin. And like I say, I didn't recognize Charlie, because the last time I saw Charlie, he had jet black hair and everything, you know, and a young face. And when I saw him in '94, he was balding with gray hair, and he had an old face, you know, a wrinkled, kind of wizened up face and stuff. I didn't recognize him. Anyway, he's long gone now. Anyway, he passed away several years ago. But, you know, he lived a lot longer than I thought he had anyway. But that's just another story anyway about something I recall when I was a kid. And then later on when I was a young man, meeting up with Charlie again. I remember Teresa was kind of a drama queen. And she used to call and say that she was being abused even when she wasn't. They were living in Kingston at the time, Charlie and Teresa were. And she'd call my grandparents, and my grandparents then would get my dad to go up and find out what's happening. So we had to go up there lots of times. I remember one time she called and said that Charlie was beating the hell out of her. So we get in the car and we drive to Kingston. And this was back in the early 70s. And Charlie wasn't even home. Charlie was out delivering pizzas. He was working for some pizza place and he was delivering pizzas around Kingston. He wasn't even home, you know. So yeah, that sort of thing used to happen quite a bit with her. But anyway, hi, beautiful boy. Yeah, you're a beautiful boy. And I remember my cousin Alan, who I kind of grew up with him. He was just a few months younger than me. That was Teresa and her husband, Alan Sr.'s son, from when they were still together. And I remember we went up there one time when we brought Alan back with us. And when we brought Alan back with us, he was upset because Teresa had promised to take him to the Cat's Meow. And he really wanted to go to the Cat's Meow. Well, the Cat's Meow was a dive bar in Kingston. And I guess she'd promised she'd take him down there to the Cat's Meow. But the Cat's Meow was not a good place to go. In fact, people had gone into the Cat's Meow and not come out. Like, people had literally disappeared. You know, because there was a lot of underworld activity around the Cat's Meow. It wasn't a place to take a child, that's for sure. It wasn't a place any sensible adult would go, really. But anyway, like I say, I can tell lots of stories, lots of Teresa stories. I'm probably not going to tell too many on here just because the woman is still alive. And I don't think it'd be, you know, I probably already have said more than I should, really. But anyway, it's kind of interesting, though, to think that back in those days, we thought that man was dead for 20 years. And then what is he? And then he shows up standing in front of me at my door. I couldn't believe it. But yeah, it turns out it wasn't Charlie Virgin who was killed in the car anyway back then. It was a fella by the name of Eddie Dellier that had fallen asleep in his $50 car and been asphyxiated. But I suspected the teenagers that were found at the end of the laneway were driving something along those lines. Probably an old 40s or 50s or maybe very early 60s car that had some rust issues and some exhaust issues, and that hadn't been repaired, and that they had and that anyway the carbon monoxide got to them. But that's the thing I do remember that though. I remember, this is another kind of an awful story in a way, but I remember we were leaving the IGA store, the grocery store, the IGA food liner in Perth. And I remember we still had the 62 Pontiac, so this was in the early 70s. I was sitting on the bench seat between my dad and my mom. And there was this early 50s, it was like a panel truck, an early 50s panel truck in front of us. And somebody had painted it blue, and you could see every brush stroke. They'd done a terrible job. They painted it with a paintbrush. And just a thing, and you could see black paint bleeding through it and stuff. It was just awful. What Anyway, it turns out that was a hippie, and they had done it. They had bought Blair and Sons' old hearse. Blair and Sons was a funeral parlor in Perth. And they had bought their old hearse. He had bought their old hearse and painted it blue, and he was living in it. And it was a truck belonging to them anyway, but they'd sold it to him, and he was living in it. And my dad hated hippies. Just despised them. He had no use for anybody who wouldn't work. That was a big thing with my dad. You had to work. He had a very strong work ethic, and he had no patience for people who didn't work. And anyway, we're following this thing, and my dad is in a blind rage because he wants to get going. My dad didn't have a lot of patience, and getting behind somebody who was moving really slow just drove him crazy. And we couldn't get out of the parking lot quick enough for him because we had this friggin' panel truck in front of us. And my dad is sitting there, and he's just in a rage. And he started to yell. He just started to yell, GD effing hippie. He said, nothing but a lazy, and he went on and on and on. He said, yeah, buy an effing old hearse, paint it blue with a paintbrush, and live in the effing thing because you're too effing lazy to work. I remember that. He was just beside himself with rage, my dad was. Anyway, the sad part of that story is, in the fall, before winter came, that hippie, he actually committed suicide in the back of that panel truck. That's another story about somebody that was found dead in a vehicle back then. Anyway, he committed suicide. And after that, Blair and Sons, whenever they were finished with a vehicle, they would not put it up for sale. They used to give the vehicles to Cliff Kelford, who was the scrap man in our area. He was a good friend of mine, Cliff Kelford was. But they used to give him all their vehicles, and there was always a condition attached when he would get a vehicle from them, that vehicle was never to see the road again. That was always a condition. He wasn't allowed to sell those vehicles or anything. That when he got that vehicle, that was it for that vehicle. It was never to see the road again. Anyway, but that was the reason, because of that panel truck and what happened with it, Anyway, that's it. Just some stories I remember from when I was a kid, anyway. Yeah, I'll never forget my dad just in a blind rage, Of course, what he used to do is he used to come on the shoe factory, used to pay on Thursdays, and by that time he was working for the shoe factory in town. He was an industrial mechanic and a tool and die maker. And he used to pick my mom up on her lunch hour, give him her paycheck. He'd sign his paycheck and hand it to her. She'd take it into the store and buy the groceries, and in those days the grocery store would cash your paycheck. So she'd give them the signed paycheck. They'd deduct the amount of the groceries from it, and then they'd hand her the cash. And then she'd bring that out to my dad when she came out with the groceries. She'd give my dad the remaining cash, But my dad would pick her up on his lunch hour. And so he was always in a hurry because he only had an hour to go out to our place and get her. and have her do the shopping and then bring her back, get all the groceries into the house and get back to work. So it was always a rushed kind of a thing, you know. And having this slow-moving vehicle in front of him really frustrated him. And he'd get frustrated with anybody anyway like that because he didn't have a lot of patience. He hated to wait. You know, he just hated to wait. And he hated to be behind some slowpoke. You know, he, even if he didn't have any reason to be in a hurry, he always was in a hurry. So he didn't have any patience for that at all. And like I say, on top of that, he hated hippies. He absolutely despised hippies. He despised anybody who didn't work. And he really despised hippies. And so, you know, because the whole hippie lifestyle seems to be centered a lot around not working, you know. And so for him, it was kind of the perfect storm, you know, ending up being held up by this hippie, you know, or whatever. Here he had to get back to work. The hippie didn't have a job to go to. He didn't have a care in the world, you know. That's the way my dad saw it anyway. So, yeah, anyway, it was a perfect storm for my dad. It sent him into a blind rage. I'll tell you, he was really mad. Anyway, that's it for now. That's just another story that came to mind as I was talking. I better stop now. I'm up to 21 minutes, so I'll shut this down now. But these are just some stories I remember from when I was a kid. Anyway, we'll see y'all later.